Dr. Wayne Frederick is an actual doctor. He writes in a piece at higher education. Um, he sees universities as think tanks of America. He said in this discussion, he believed all higher education institutions had to be at the forefront of providing solutions to tackle racism. And he believes Howard University, where he is the president, is at the tip of the spear there. Well, let's have that discussion then. We're pleased to be joined by Dr. Wayne A.I. Frederick. He's the president of Howard University. Dr. Frederick, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So, universities need to be at the forefront of providing solutions to tackle racism. Um, do you have a one or two solutions in mind, and have you seen them implemented on the college campuses anywhere to the effect of reducing racism and improving cohesion?
Yeah, absolutely. I think our universities should be providing solutions. We should take our protests and turn them into policy, and Howard University has a strong history of doing that. If we go back to the 1950s, Brown versus the Board of Education, several Howard University lawyers and members of the law school faculty participated in that activity to bring about that law, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, that resulted in the desegregation of our education system.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, an example of where our university and in general our universities can provide that help, and especially being the cauldron for where young people really form their ideas and their personalities. I think we have a major opportunity there as well to get them to participate in the general society in the way that we would like them to.
Well, that's a great example of Brown v. Board of Education, seminal case uh, to relegate to the ash heap of history this notion of separate but equal. And yet, fast forward to 2020 America, and Evergreen State University has a blackout day, whites off campus. This was what led to Brett Weinstein's confrontation with students at Evergreen State University, with which I'm sure you're familiar. And we see in the autonomous zone in Seattle doing the same thing, a space for black people only. So all that effort, which frankly still needs to go on because so many cities like the one we live in, Chicago, are de facto segregated. So all that emphasis on desegregation and integration and equality before the law and eliminating separate but equal. And yet we have on campuses and to some extent in larger society a push for de facto resegregation.
Well, I think part of it obviously is that people are going to protest when we don't get what we want in terms of a completeness of the outcome. And so, yes, that does result in a push that where the pendulum swings too far. And clearly, in those instances that you're mentioning, the pendulum has swung too far. But we have to be mindful that the pendulum didn't get there on its own. It got there because of constant ignoring of what we felt was necessary, even in terms of the desegregation of our schools. If you look in the South, there are more schools with 75% of one race or another than there were before Brown versus the Board of Education. So as a society, we have set up systems that have gotten us there. And again, I'm not necessarily saying that I support that or not, but I think that is what does happen in our system. It happens in our electoral system. In terms of elections, you get a black president, and unfortunately or fortunately, for some, that leads to the election of a president that looks exactly opposite to him as a correction. And November's election may again result in another swing back as people have seen something that they probably don't want. So it is about some of that balance as well.
Do you think that it's all of this is explained through a racial prism, or is it a socioeconomic prism? As, for example, Bob Woodson would argue, who spent the last 40 years of his life at the Woodson Center trying to advance the interests of people who are in poverty, white, black, Latino, and otherwise. Because it seems to me that there's a real policy divide and there's a real cultural divide and it revolves maybe more around the level of education than it does the particular race of a person or the socioeconomic profile of a person more so than the race of a person. Uh, Even though I understand minorities are disproportionately at the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder.
I think it's a mixture of both. You have to always remember, as uncomfortable as the discussion about slavery is, it was an economic impetus. And even at the end of slavery, people were compensated for giving up their slaves. So there has always been an economic underpinning of why slavery existed. And as a result, that economic underpinning, even as you undid slavery to emancipation, you still needed a system that created an unequal setup for the economics and the finances to still work. And so we get into Jim Crow, et cetera. A lot of this is based on economics. When you look at housing discrimination to the 20s all the way into the 60s and 70s, again, a system that benefited in terms of finances, one social group versus another. And yes, you're right. It some of those economic things have no race, but they disproportionately affect African Americans. And so I think there's a mix of both. And then when you layer on top of that the cultural back and forth that the country gets as we go through different eras, I think you see that as well. You come out of a civil rights era and into the 70s where there's this liberal movement of bringing everyone together, et cetera. And yet still here we are some 50 years later, still back in the midst of trying to undo a system that has disproportionately affected some.
So, 5 days after George Floyd was killed by police in Minneapolis, you published a letter to your staff and students saying, quote, "We were born for such a time as this." Can you explain?
Yeah, I think young people today, if you look at any research on young people today, they are far more altruistic than the two generations above them, and that includes my generation and even my parents' generation as well. And what that says is that they are concerned about others, they have more information about others, they're more accepting of others, and therefore some of the systems that we've had in the past that have failed us, they are probably best positioned because of their prism of society to undo the wrongs that have occurred in the past and also to set us on a path of a system that's sustainable and that would resist falling back into some of these familiar traps.
Walter Williams, the econ professor at George Mason University, points out from the late 1800s to 1950, some black schools were models of academic achievement in spite of institutional racism, racism under the law, subjugation of black Americans under the law. He notes black students at Washington's Dunbar High School often outscored white students as early as 1899. Schools such as Frederick Douglass in Baltimore, Booker T. Washington, Atlanta, PS 91 in Brooklyn, and others operated at a similar level of excellence. What's happened to K through 12 education? Why have we seen so little progress, in many respects, regression 120 years later?
Yeah, well, when we look at the funding of our school system, it has become politically charged. And as a result of that, the mix of that and housing discrimination, the poverty within those areas, and the breakdown of the family have all contributed to a difficult past in terms of us trying to get students through that system. And what we have seen today, for instance, on Howard's campus, we have a middle school. And those students who come to our middle school, it's a charter school, they come by lottery. They tend to perform below their grade when they get to Howard. By the time they leave and go off to all these different high schools, at the end of that period, 95% of them over a 15-year period end up going to college, with about 60% of them choosing STEM disciplines and some 88% of them getting scholarships.
Mm-hmm.
They will, if you stop one of those kids on my campus today and ask them where they go to school, they'll tell you, I go to Howard University. Just putting them in that environment every day, having to come and walk around a college campus to attend school, gives them confidence. And I think the one ingredient that our school system often misses, regardless of how you bring that ingredient in, whether it's with new facilities, good teachers, or the environment around them is confidence. Once you instill confidence in a young child, it goes a long way in terms of their academic achievement.
Well, so then you, based on that, would be a proponent of rethinking how we're doing sort of command control K through 12 education, particularly in urban centers. It's not working, clearly.
It's not working, but I think it's also complicated. When you look at where people go to school, I mean, Washington, D.C. is a classic example. You have pockets in this area where the D.C. public school system has some very excellent schools, but what you quickly see is a clustering of residents around that particular school,
Right.
housing prices going up through the roof, and essentially those parent-teachers associations become almost semi-private associations. So it's a matter of who can afford. And as those residents who
Right.
lived there before get displaced, you have an undoing of the system. So you need a leveling of the system with funding throughout that's more consistent and even. And you also need the other social determinants of success, such as food insecurity, et cetera, to be
Yeah.
addressed as well.
Well, I mean, so if how Howard University, the system in which Howard University operates, the collegiate system, if that works for post K through 12 education, why wouldn't it work for K through 12 education? Meaning,
Well, and I, yeah,
yeah, marginal students that are being marginalized because of their household income and their address should have the same opportunity as people that are come from wealthier households. What's so complicated about
great.
that?
Yeah, great question. What's complicated about it is that Howard University is unique in that we are getting, to some extent, the cream of the crop. We get 25,000 applications. When we look at the SAT scores and GPAs of our incoming class, they are about 300 points higher on the SAT score than the average African American student in that income bracket. And when you look at standardized tests that are already culturally biased and skewed, we clearly are getting a very unusual, high performing, low income student. So I often tell people I want to be cautious when you even look at Howard University as an experiment. There's several things about Harvard University that's unusual. We employ more African American faculty than any other tertiary institution in this country.
Yeah,
We,
I'm sorry to
Mhm.
interrupt, but I mean, I concede your point about Howard and its sort of unique success in American history. But hey, not everybody gets to go to Howard. Not everybody gets to go to Harvard. Not everybody gets to go to Northwestern. But you know what? You get a good education at Illinois or Illinois State or Michigan State or Iowa or wherever. So I mean, it's not that everybody gets to go to Harvard, just like everybody gets to go to the best high school in a particular city or a particular state. It's the fact that you have better
Correct.
educational options that are better fits for you. You have choice where you don't have that in most urban centers outside of those that have advanced opportunity scholarship programs.
Yeah, and I'm not saying no. I think the point I was trying to make is that the funding of that still needs to be normalized, right? So Howard University sends more African Americans to medical school as an example. But when you look at our endowment against the endowment of much larger institutions or better funded institutions, for what the country gets, the return on that investment is not even. And so what we do in terms of what we are able to supply is very, very different. So all I'm saying is that I do agree with you that if the fundamentals of providing that education on an even basis are adopted and then we fund those things appropriately, we can get there. Absolutely agree with you. But it does take a hard look at the system from soup to nuts in order to do it.
I wanted to ask you about the importance you place on agency in these conversations you have with staff and students.
Hmm.
Ian Rowe, who has run a successful charter school operation in the South Bronx, mostly Black and Latino students, writing in the Wall Street Journal this week, the narrative that white people hold the power conveys a wrong-headed notion of white superiority, creates an illusion of Black dependency on white largesse. This false assignment of responsibility, while coming from an authentic desire to produce change, can create a kind of new mental enslavement. Do you agree that so much of the conversation really removes agency from Black Americans, trivializes them, really marginalizes them, and that is unhelpful?
Yeah, you certainly don't want to remove agency, and I absolutely agree with that. You don't want to, but let's be sure that we are going to be objective about how that agency was removed in the first place, or whether or not somebody is actually trying to replace agency that has already been removed. I think in some of these circumstances, the agency has already been removed or degraded in such a way that there is no agency to speak of, and that some of the advocacy that is required is necessary because you have a subset of people who are now in a circumstance in which they cannot move forward or move into circumstances that would be for their betterment unless somebody else advocates or unless the system is changed. So I just want to be, I absolutely agree. You don't want to remove the agency, but I'm just not sure that in all these circumstances, the agency really does exist still.
And how do you look at this charge of systemic racism in America, particularly with a little bit of historical context, just looking at sort of one indicator, just one, but one metric is the level of African American representation in positions of authority, power, elective office, for example. And obviously that has increased exponentially over the last 50 years. And yet again, where you have a disproportionate location of minorities in urban centers around the country, there doesn't seem, despite the Great Society funding and the greater presence of blacks in positions of authority, there doesn't seem to be great improvement in the areas of education and economic opportunity and public safety. How do you explain that?
Right. So a couple of things I think when you look at this. So for instance, in elected public offices, especially if you look at the U.S. Congress, 40% of the African Americans in the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate attended historically black colleges and universities. Those historically black colleges and universities account for only 3% of the institutions in our country, but are responsible for 22% of all of the African Americans in this country who receive bachelor's degrees, and in the STEM disciplines account for 34%. So if you look at judges, 80% of them who are African American have attended historically black colleges and universities. So the point being that we have moved an undue burden onto one very small, under-resourced segment of the society to get there and to springboard there. So what you're seeing in terms of that springboard is really a concentrated effort in one area, unfortunately at the tertiary education level. And so some of what you see in terms of the lack of balance is that you don't have enough voices to lift up and say that. The other thing is I think our history is uneven. Prior to Jim Crow, we don't tell the history of the black congressmen and members of the House of Representatives and so on in this country. And I also think that that's a missed opportunity as well, in terms of us recognizing as a nation that prior to that era, we did have some representation and we did have some progress that was stymied by the Jim Crow era. And as we look at this era as well, and we look at the advances that you're talking about in terms of public safety and education, there's a much larger, complicated system that one or two people cannot overthrow. And you can't expect that those one or two people only come to 3% of the higher ed institutions in this country. That's an undue burden, especially for an under-resourced segment.
He is Dr. Wayne A.I. Frederick. He is the president of Howard University. Dr. Frederick, pleasure to talk to you. I hope to do it again soon. Thanks so much for joining us.
Same here. Appreciate you very much. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Connect with Dan and Amy on the AM 560 The Answer mobile app. Just text the word app to 64636 to download the app today.
Stop wasting energy. There's a better way. Your company could be receiving energy efficiency incentives by recycling waste heat from on-site power generation equipment and turning it into useful energy. Charles Equipment will get you up and running and help your business cash in on energy efficient rebates from ComEd with cogeneration, also known as CHP, Combined Heat and Power, a clean and efficient way to generate heat and power. CHP systems can supply at least a portion of a building's electrical load and capture waste heat from hot exhaust gases for use in heating, cooling, hot water, and dehumidification. Charles Equipment can install and manage the cogen equipment at your facility and help your energy use become 70 to 90% more efficient. Start making better, more energy efficient decisions and save money in the process. Incentives are available to non-residential ComEd customers regardless of retail electric supplier.